Welcome. This is Andre Marcoux. I'm the director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. I always say it's a hell of a long name. The topic today is the CBAM and the if you're on the evaluation of the EU, the Commission's proposal on the CBAM. We are waiting for a few minutes for people to sign in. It does take time until everybody gets in. But what I would like to do is take this time and introduce a little bit how we're going to run this. And we will start with the initial remarks from Vicente Hurtado Roa, who's the head of unit in DG TaxSud. So he's the man responsible for writing this stuff. We're all behind him at this point. And we're very grateful that you take the time, as we don't take for granted the time. We know there are many demands on your time. And then we have shared with the speakers our evaluation. I'll explain, there are two pieces to what we have prepared. And we will focus on the summary for policymakers mostly. So Michael Mealing and Aaron Cosby and myself and Alexandra Maratu will present this summary for policymakers that we have put together. And then we'll get reactions from a number of stakeholders. Paweł Rosicki from Poland, Charlene Hemraj from South Africa, Killian O'Donoghue from Eurometaux, Caroline Diri-Birbeck from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. These are all people that have been involved. We try to make it also not, it is of course a European initiative, but it is something that it impacts the world at large, including trade relations with our trading partners across the world. So this is why we have introduced here stakeholders from outside the EU. So the way we're waiting for a few more minutes, I think that we're almost there, but as always, today we are back to a virtual meeting. We have tried very hard to make these meetings either hybrid or in person. I think we're getting there. Slowly we're getting there, but not yet. We see the trend in Europe with Denmark, Norway, Italy going back to the offices. So the trend is there. It looks like very shortly we're going to be back to a normal working environment. So what I'll do now, I think it's time to move on with our first intervention from Vicente Hurtado Roa. Vicente, I think you never heard of ERCST, you never heard of us before. Now I don't know, hopefully you haven't had enough yet, but certainly we have been a group that has tried to make a contribution with what I think it's a good team of colleagues. And we've gone, as you know, through a number of papers, of contributions to the debate. And the latest one is two elements. One of them is the guide and the other one is summary of policymakers. You've seen our thinking. So I invite you to comment a little bit on the things that we have said, but in general, feel free to react to the stage where the discussion is, where is it going, and what the thinking is in the Commission right now. So again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andre, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to come to discuss these issues with you. I have to say that your organization is one of the most active on CBAM, and you're doing a great job in order to promote and to make people knowledgeable about the CBAM, which is a complex issue. I don't know if you will get tired of ours before we get tired of you, but in anything, I think it's a good symbiosis. And of course, we need to continue working on the CBAM. I came to this forum already, I think it was on the 20th of July, 4 days or 6 days after the adoption of the Fit for 55 package. As you know, the CBAM is one of the 14 measures that were part of the package, and I already presented the main lines of the final proposal. We had discussed a lot before that, and now I think that you already have all the elements. You have the proposal on the table. So I would like to say a few words maybe about the reactions that we are receiving from all stakeholders, and I will refer to your guide and to your brief for policymakers that I have read, and thanks a lot for sharing them with us in advance. And where I think that you raised, the main issues you raise are the main concerns or issues raised by the industry, by the public administration of the member states, or also by third countries. Maybe just to say before I start with the matter, that of course the proposal that was adopted by the Commission tried to find a fair balance between different elements. I would never say objectives, because the objective is always one, which is the fight against climate change and the protection of the environment. But of course, the elements we had to take into account were, on one hand, to preserve this objective as much as possible at EU level, but also international level. This is why we refer to reducing the risk of carbon leakage, reducing emissions, pushing third countries to go greener. But then also we had to make sure that we were mirroring the ETS as much as possible, because this is the carbon price in the EU, and that brings some complexity into the system. At the same time, we needed to content or to be able to reduce the administrative burden as much as possible. And finally, we had to be compliant with WTO rules. All that put into the cocktail gave us what now is the proposal by the Commission, and that has already started the discussions in the Council. We already had 2 meetings with the Council in September. We will have another 2 more meetings, in November. And we are waiting for the Parliament to appoint the rapporteur. There are some rumors. You know that the ENVI committee will be leading, but there will be 3 other committees which will be involved. And therefore, we are still waiting for the rapporteurs to be announced or appointed in order to also engage with the Parliament. But we will do that in parallel. So coming to the matter, and thanks a lot for the guide, thanks a lot for the brief. I think they're very important, and they will also be a good basis for keeping the debate in the public fora. As I said, the issues raised by you are similar to the issues raised by the administration of the 27 member states, also by the industry or by third countries, not necessarily on the same direction, as you can imagine. And it's there again where we need to try to find a balance. I will refer to 5 points in your documents, which I think it's important that we also clarify our views and also give you some insights from the stakeholders. One of them is the export rebate or the treatment of exports. The second one is the implicit carbon pricing. The third one is direct versus indirect emissions. The fourth one is the coverage in terms of sectors. And the final point is on the Ldcs, possibility for exemptions, or in any case, how to redirect part of the investments, of the revenues from the CBAM to the Ldcs. On the export rebate, I have talked about that quite extensively in the past. You know the views of the Commission with respect to the introduction of an export measure. I can tell you that still the industry is much concerned with competitiveness and when it comes to exports in third countries, and they push for such a measure. And also some member states are interested in analyzing the export rebate. What I can tell you is that we look at this in our impact assessment. Let's put aside the legal analysis, which for us brings a lot of doubts about compliance with WTO. But if we talk about other aspects, like for example, the impact on the EU industry, I can tell you that the impact is quite limited, taking into account the goods that are part of the CBAM at this moment, and therefore what is the share of the production of the EU which is exported to third countries. Maybe the highest impact would be on steel, iron steel, and fertilizers, but not so much relevant for the other goods. The problem I also see with the introduction of an export measure or an export rebate is that, of course, the message with the environmental goal is diluted. we can discuss about that. I know that, for example, you say that it could have an impact also in the increase of the carbon intensity of the exports. So some people are really very critical about this type of measures. Others say, yeah, but we have to make sure that we have the level playing field with the countries. If we don't have an export rebate, then there won't be such also incentive for the countries to become greener. Okay, we really think that an export rebate doesn't give the signal, has a lot of problems with WTO compliance, and also we think that honestly the relevance of the measure is less important. You also, the second point is on the implicit carbon pricing. This is an issue which is important, for example, for countries like the US or Australia, where they don't have a carbon price in place. They have other regulatory measures, and they would like to make sure that the CBAM in the EU also takes into account their implicit carbon pricing. Well, first, we only look, or we only accept the explicit carbon pricing, and it can be an ETS or it can be a carbon tax. First, because it's what we think can be measured quantitatively easily. We are also mirroring the ETS, and therefore, for that reason, we will take into account the same measure as in the EU. We decided to extend also to the carbon tax because we understand that both systems are the most spread systems across the world, and the two could be alternatives. They don't work in the same way. For those of you who are experts, you know that an ETS is a cap and trade system, so you cap and then you let the market to set the price, while a carbon tax is the opposite. You set the price and then you let the market decide on the number of emissions. We can discuss extensively whether one measure or another is better than another. In any case, what we came is to the conclusion that we could accept an explicit carbon price at the origin. An implicit carbon price puts more problems from a technical point of view, how to estimate the implicit carbon price, first thing. Second thing, the EU also have other regulatory measures. We have, for example, standards for cars. We have some standards for technology. We also will introduce blending obligations. We have blending obligations for road transport. We will introduce also now blending obligations for aviation and maritime. All these could also translate into a sort of implicit carbon price. If we will have to start accepting implicit carbon price in third countries, which would need to bring also into the picture of the CBAM, not only the price of the ETS, but also this implicit carbon price. And thirdly, and which is very important as well, is that we recognize the importance of implicit carbon pricing. By introducing implicit carbon pricing in third countries, that will have an impact on emissions if they are really effective with those measures. And then in that way, the CBAM will also reconsider the impact of implicit carbon price on the reduction of emissions. So in one way or another, the implicit carbon pricing will be recognized in the CBAM. However, we know the OECD is very much interested in analyzing implicit, explicit. So I think that this is an area that for sure is not closed and that we need to merit some sort of discussion at international level. Indirect emissions, as you saw in the final text, we only cover for the moment direct emissions. During the transitional period until 2025, we will be collecting information not only on direct, but also on indirect emissions. And the objective, of course, is to analyze the situation with indirect emissions and how we can better introduce the measure or bring the indirect emissions also into the scope of the directive. We are not saying that we don't want to include indirect emissions. I know that some industries, some sectors or some NGOs are very much interested in covering indirect emissions. Otherwise, we are losing a part of the picture. And I kind of personally agree with that. But we need the time to think this thoughtfully. And in particular, because there is this debate, and those who know the aluminium sector in particular will know quite well, which is the difference between direct indirect emissions and direct indirect cost. We always refer to free allowances. We tend to forget in the discussions that there is also another sort of compensation to the EU industry, which is the indirect cost for, or compensations for indirect cost of electricity. And therefore, if we introduce CBAM or if we introduce the indirect emissions also into the scope of the CBAM, we will need to think about the phase out also of this compensation. But then again, this compensation covers the indirect cost, and the indirect cost in the third country not necessarily could be exactly the measurement of the indirect emissions. Sorry, this is a bit technical, but those who know, I said, the aluminum sector, for example, or sectors which are very much dependent on electricity will understand. With that, and that's the important thing, we will reconsider the introduction also of the indirect emissions already from 2026, but we need time from now until 2025 to collect the information, to discuss with the sectors concerned, and also to analyze how in third countries they also set or estimate the indirect emissions and indirect costs associated to the electricity production. A fourth point raised also in your paper is about limited coverage of sectors. Some people complain that the coverage is too short. Some people complain that the coverage is too large. We decided to start with a number of sectors. You will remember that in the European Green Deal, we already announced that. We are not going to start with all sectors, not even all sectors at risk of carbon leakage. We made a short list of the sectors that cover most of the emissions, sectors which are very much intensive in trade with countries, and also sectors that, for those reasons, are exposed to carbon leakage. Some of the sectors, like, for example, refineries, chemicals, polymers, I receive the question very often, which are also intensive in carbon emissions, to some extent are also subject to a lot of trade with third countries. For the moment, we're set aside, but we will also consider in the coming years, during the transitional period, whether these sectors should be brought into the picture. I have to tell you that there is a technical problem or concern. As you know, ETS assess emissions per installations. However, here, because we are talking about a border measure, a measure on imports, we have to rely on goods or on the emissions embedded or associated to the goods. So sometimes, and I can tell you, for example, with the polymers, that's the case, it is difficult to dissociate in an installation the different emissions for the different goods when they produce a big variety of groups of goods. So we are going to refine that assessment, that information, and then if possible, we will possibly consider the extension of the measure also to cover those goods. The same goes for the downstream sectors, those products or finished goods which are also intensive in the CBAM goods. The example is the production of planes or cars or other goods. So that's something that we will also analyze in the transitional period, and it might not be surprising that we come with changes before we start with the measure fully in 2026. And finally, my last point is on LDCs. I have given the arguments why we think the LDCs should not be exempted from the measure, and in our proposal, we don't suggest to do that. I know that there is some sort of sympathy for exempting LDCs within for legal reasons, but also for reasons which are linked to the objectives, environmental objectives. We don't think it's a good idea. But then it comes to the debate, the issue of how to use the revenues. As you know, the three institutions agreed to introduce a new own resource based on the revenues from the CBAM and part of the revenues from the free allowances in the ETS. The proposal has not been adopted yet. There are discussions about other elements of the proposal. We hope that before the end of the year, the Commission will adopt this proposal, which will include, of course, also the revenues from the CBAM. And then, as you know, the European Union is committed to support efforts in LDCs, including efforts to decarbonize their economies. We are happy to engage with them in order to help them to implement the CBAM and in order to implement carbon pricing measures, and of course to try to change their technology in order to become also green front runners in the future. By recycling these revenues in the EU budget, there will be also a way to support those economies. But what I can tell you is that The own resource dimension is not part of the proposal on the CBAM, which is a proposal on the measure itself, not on the revenues. But then the debate on the revenues can be, of course, moved to other arena when it comes to the better use of the EU budget. And with that, Andre, because I was supposed to speak only for 15 minutes, I think I touch upon the main issues raised by you, where we might have different views. These issues, as I said before, have also been raised by the stakeholders in one way or another. As you can imagine, the direction of our industry, EU industry, might not be necessarily the direction that third countries would like to take with the CBAM. But I think that your preoccupations, your issues are quite well received, or are also part of the discussions that we are leading now with third countries and with member states.
Thank you, Vicente. Very interesting. A couple of things that subtleties that escape me, and I'm embarrassed that I still don't get it. So the revenue is not part of the CBAM proposal. So okay, so you can't say it's part of the CBAM proposal. Maybe it's not the place to talk about it. The other part, a couple of things that inflections, at least, that I picked up, and maybe I'm reading tea leaves about, not yet, maybe in implicit and other things. But what I'd like to turn to the people on the panel, if you want, on the stakeholders, Carolyn and Killian and Charlene, Pavel, and also Maron, Michael. Do you have anything that you would like to raise with Vicente? Vicente, unfortunately, won't be able to stay for the session, but anyway, it's an opportunity to raise some things with him. I think Killian, he did say indirect emission, indirect cost. I know that's the kind of that is. I mean, he pressed all the buttons.
Yeah. I guess if I can, well, first I should say congrats to Vicente. They understand the electricity market very well, and I think that's a very impressive kind of thing. That there's a very good understanding now. Maybe something which we didn't have a year ago. So I would agree by and large with a lot of what he said. I think that, as European producers, we face this unilateral indirect costs. And if we want to include scope 2, we have to find a solution there. And once we're speaking the same language, I think that's good. I know the golden rule is we don't talk about leaked documents. I know that's a golden rule, but if I can break that rule, if we had included scope 2 based on the leak, and if we had used the methodology which was suggested, it would have meant major distortions, and would have meant that, for example, an aluminium smelter based on hydro would have paid a higher carbon cost than a fossil powered smelter outside of Europe, and that's not what we intend to do. So I think that's positive development there, and we'll see how things develop in the coming years. One thing I would say as well is the delta gets smaller. The difference between indirect cost emissions reduces, so maybe there can be some scope there. Two other small things, if I can, just while Vicente is there. He said export solutions is not such a big issue. I would have to disagree. And I think we need to look at it also from the sense that not just the sectors that are included, but also the future sectors if we do move towards this system. And for example, aluminium, it's a lot of money. It's 11 billion euros, depends obviously on the carbon price. So that's quite substantial. But also I have some sectors, and there's companies in those sectors which export 50%, 50. So for them, not having a solution export is major. So I do think it's a key issue that we need to find a solution, and hopefully the council and MEPs will find something there. But it really is fundamental, and I don't think it's wise for us in Europe not to have some solution on exports. And the very last thing I would just say, I think the measure should be tightened on circumvention. Article 27, if I'm honest, I think is quite weak. It just has basically, it's to do with products. You can, so if there's a slight change of products, you can say this is a circumvention, but it needs to be tightened. And I think we need to stop resource shuffling, and we also need to address cost absorption. So I really think Article 27 needs to be made much more foolproof. So that would be the main comments I would have to Vicente. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else? I don't know, Charlene, if you while your friends from the commission are here, where I don't know, Michael, Aaron, Pavel, you have your hand up first. If you aren't, Charlene, after that I'll come to you. Let's try and keep it short, guys.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the export issue, I think that it's also strictly connected with the free allocation, as we will remove the free allocation. So we will even make the situation of exporters worse. So that's the one issue, and another one is about the administration, because we have had two options: to set the administration on EU level, and now in the Commission proposal we've got administration in the each member states, which I think complicates a lot the whole implementation of the regulation. So just those two issues that I would like to mention: that administration and the export. So yeah.
Thank you, Pavel. So you said the Commission, Poland wants to give more power to the Commission. There you have it. You heard it first here. Carolyn?
Thank you, Andre. Just quickly, I'm sit here in Geneva in the multilateral context, Vicente, and one of the questions that arises often here in discussions, obviously you're aware of the questions around WTO compatibility, but in recent interventions, many governments have raised questions about the compatibility with the Paris Agreement's principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. And you've mentioned a couple of ways in which the EU plans to try and ensure that impacts on developing countries are managed. But my sense is there's going to be an ongoing political discussion about this, and especially in the context of the failure of many countries to meet their climate finance obligations, for example. So the challenge for developing countries is how seriously can they take these assurances that there'll be technical assistance, there'll be technology, there'll be financing to help them, when they also really want to be able to compete in this greener global economy as well. So just how do you see the CBAM in that wider context of trying to make sure they're partners in greener trade rather than feeling punished?
Charlene, I'd love to be in your seat right now, but I can't. I'm a chair, but I know what I would say. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Andre. I think just to say that we welcome the development around the inclusion of carbon taxes and recognition that these are explicit carbon prices, and to consider how they can be taken into account in the CBAM. I think just two issues from my side is around implicit carbon pricing, and especially for developing economies. So we already have policies around renewable energy, specific standards in terms of clean fuels that are already implemented as well. And these impose costs on our industries. So it's just interesting. It would be interesting to hear a perspective around a regime that takes into account developing economies in terms of implicit carbon pricing. And the second issue, Andre, is around the LDCs, but broader than that in terms of the use of revenues. And there is the requirement or the principle around the Paris Agreement in terms of just transition, and recognizing that workers, especially in emissions intensive fossil-based economies and like South Africa, that these sectors will be extremely vulnerable as we make the shift to renewable energy and alternative green technologies, which we have committed to. But in order to make this transition, there will be costs. And the costs associated with things like upgrading grid infrastructure, training workers, etc., in terms of shifting to alternative jobs, as well as in terms of the green industrialization. So it would be interesting to just get a perspective around that, because at this stage, if you're taking South Africa, for example, and a few other emission and fossil fuel-based economies dependent on coal, we have implemented policies domestically. They are there to help us with the transition, but we will not be able to achieve that entirely without that financial support, especially around the just transition. Thanks.
Vicente, I think you have a minute to respond to all this, but I hope that maybe a little bit more than a minute, if we can stretch that minute.
Yeah, I can spend 1 minute. The problem is that we could spend hours and hours discussing all these issues, and maybe I would not get to convince you. I mean, on the export rebate, Kilian, Pavel, as I said before, maybe the impact will be higher when it comes to an extension to other goods in the future. I don't disagree with that, for sure. I hope that by then also the impact will be lower, in the sense that already the CBAM, we can see that it's having an impact on third countries, because before we started with the CBAM, there was not much discussion about carbon pricing and about reducing emissions. I think that the Paris Agreement was a bit, not dead, but dormant, even if maybe also because COP26 had to be postponed because of the COVID. But now we see that there is there are new dynamics with the introduction of the proposal of the CBAM, and we expect also the third countries will be reducing their emissions. So let's see what happens in the next years. Let's see what will be needed. You are right, maybe the parliament, maybe some member states will be pushing for some sort of measure. We will need to look at what exactly they would like to propose, but in any case, we have a bottom line, which is to be compliant with WTO rules. Otherwise, Caroline or the rest will jump on my back and say, no, you have a problem. So, and we don't want to have a problem. So let's look at that. I tell you what I know, or what we know, what we have analyzed so far, and let's see in the coming months. Kilian, you mentioned indirect emissions and the leaked version. Yeah, there was a big difference between the leaked version and the final version. We will work with you. We will involve you also on the study or on the analysis of indirect emissions, direct emissions, indirect cost, direct cost. I think we need to find a solution for that. I'm completely convinced that we need to include indirect emissions into the scope, but we have to do it in a way that will not penalize our industry and which will be completely useless or ineffective, because in third countries, there will be means to avoid that. And that links to your third point on circumvention. We analyzed, we all, I mean, again, it's always the same. We try to find a balance between what we can propose and what is also compliant with WTO, with Paris Agreement, with other international engagements. And that's why, okay, the article which is in the proposal is what we thought was a good balance. Everything can be improved. So I'm not going to say that we are perfect, that we came with the only solution. We receive proposals from the industry how to strengthen the anti-circumvention measure, and we will work with member states in order to improve the provision if there is a way to do that. The more we can do to avoid resource shuffling, the better for all of us. I mean, we are not against that, so we are open to listen to you. Pavel, you mentioned administrative cost. As I said before, we try to find the balance again. We want to mirror the ETS on one hand, but at the same time, we don't want to bring too much administrative cost on our industry, on our administration, but also on third countries. I think we have plenty of time from now until 2026 to work with everyone, with the national authorities, the national climate authorities in member states, but also with third countries. One of the reasons why we came with the transitional period is also to allow time for the verification system to be in place. We know that many countries around the world, they don't have an ETS, they don't have carbon taxes, so they don't have the possibilities of measuring carbon pricing or introducing measures to do that. So we hope that in the next years, and we are going to reinforce, of course, the communication, the engagement with third countries in order to make sure that the administrative burden will be the lowest possible. I know that the proposal has some complexity. I hope that we will be able to explain, but believe me, I mean, this is where we thought we could draw the line between something which is respectful of all engagements and is WTO compliant, and at the same time is not so complex in terms of red tape. Caroline, you mentioned the Paris Agreement, well, WTO, clear, and then you mentioned whether we are respectful of the Paris Agreement. I can tell you that yes, we are completely convinced, because we are not imposing any sort of ETS or carbon pricing on third countries. They are allowed to do as they want. They are allowed to reduce their emissions at their own pace as they think. What is clear is the Paris Agreement is not respected by everyone around the world. What is clear is the EU is increasing its level of ambition quite a lot beyond the Paris Agreement, and therefore we want to make sure that the goods imported into the EU apply the same rules that the goods produced in the European Union. We are not imposing anything on third countries, okay? But we expect that there will be, of course, a behavior change. But what we want to make sure is that imports into the EU respect the same rules. If by this we manage to push them to become greener and therefore to comply with their responsibilities under the Paris Agreement, all the better. And that links to the point raised by Charlene on LDCs. We engage with LDCs with the countries. One of my favorite examples, and I don't know why it has become one of the paradigms in the international discussions, is the case of Mozambique, your neighbor. Mozambique produces aluminium, which is not so much relevant in terms of
with South African power.
That's what I was going to explain. I suppose that Charlie knows very, very well. They produce hydropower quite extensively, but because of the PPAs and also because of their grid and geographical distribution, all that electricity is exported to South Africa, and then they produce aluminium with dirty electricity. So that's, for example, just to give you an example where we are engaging, we are analyzing the case, we try to find solutions for cases like this when we see that there is clearly an interest or a motivation to decarbonize, where they are producing electricity from green technologies like the hydropower, and that for one reason or another, there is some sort of mismatch between the production of clean electricity and the production of aluminium. I don't know what will be the solution. I can't tell you. I hope that South Africa will also produce more and more clean electricity, not just importing from Mozambique, but also producing. And I'm trying to follow closely developments in South Africa, because I think that you have to be one of the front runners for sure in Africa for the decarbonization. Our proposal, and that goes back also to you, Andre, doesn't deal with revenues. It's purely the design of the measure. Revenues, on one hand, is part of the new decision on own resources that will come to the light before the end of the year, hopefully. And then, of course, is the question of how we use the budget. There, the Council and the Parliament have a lot to say.
Vicente, if I may, just two quick things before you go. One is, do you really expect any money out of this? Because if I were a government, I would never allow anybody to pay you any money. I would tax the hell out of them and pay me the money. Why pay to these nice Europeans? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. So my expectation is, if you get anything, it would be a trickle. I mean, that would be my expectation, or if people behave in an economically rational way. The second question that I would have, and you opened the door on this, I'm not a lawyer, but they say you opened the door on this. You said that you want to make sure that, and Killian is not going to like this, but that you want to make sure that the products that are imported in the EU are taxed at the same, or pay the same carbon price as what is done in the EU. But if the South Africans, if Mozambique or anybody, I don't know, Chinese, export all the clean aluminum to the EU, I mean, that meets your condition. Why are you so concerned about resource shuffling? On the basis of what?
Okay, on your first point, on the revenues, our estimations are very low for the CBAM. And of course, it's difficult to give a figure because everything depends much on what will be the reaction in third countries. So, of course, it will depend on the number of sectors, the number of products, how much we import, but then secondly, on the reaction of countries. Since the measure will be in place from 2026, I cannot anticipate whether the CBAM will have a tracking effect or pushing third countries to become cleaner. When we talk about a higher figure for the revenues, is because we are also including the revenues from the free allowances that will be gone. As you know, we have this phase in, phase out. So if by the end we get rid of the free allowances, and then the revenues from those free allowances will also become part of the own resource, then it means that the revenues will come mainly from there. So revenues mainly will come from EU producers rather than from imports from third countries.
That's provocative. My second part is provocative, but it really has. I've got into arguments with my friends Aaron and Michael over this one. I know it's a mantra, we avoid this thing, but I'm trying to find if the purpose of the exercise is to make sure that the guy who makes widgets in the EU and the guy who makes widgets in China pays the same price for the carbon embedded on it. Why do I care whether they export only the nice clean ones? I don't know what they do with the rest of the stuff. I don't care.
No, there is another point linked to what you said about the revenues. For example, and I will be clear, Russia's papers announced that Russia could be considering introducing a carbon price only for exports. As you can imagine, this is not acceptable. This is a sort of not resource shuffling, but circumvention measure. We don't want the revenues. Let's speak. I mean, with total honesty, what we want is that the goods that come into the EU are clean as much as possible, and if they are not clean, that they will have paid a carbon price. So this is the objective. So either third countries introduce green technologies and export green products to the EU, and then we will get something. We have to think about resource shuffling, of course. If they only produce green products for the EU and they continue polluting and they don't reduce their global emissions, then we will have an issue of resource shuffling. And that's the point by Killian on circumvention. So we need to tighten also this circumvention measure. But the other thing is that we want them also to introduce carbon pricing measures, because we think that by this, they will reduce emissions. Of course, if they only do it to make sure that they get the money and they don't give the money to the EU, that's not the objective of the measure. So we will have to think also about how to tighten this in order to avoid that sort of practices. So that's not a resource shuffling, but that's a circumvention also, of course, of the measure.
Yeah. No, I think these are things that we need to think about how to deal with it, because in the end, we want something that works and something that supports the environment and that is in line with WTO. And that's, I mean, it's a lot. My recollection is like an equation with optimizing at 3 levels, or I can't remember what it was in my calculus, my old calculus days. Was there any quick reaction from anybody, Killian? But let's keep it very, very short, because I don't think I don't want to push it, because we want him back at some point.
I'll be very short. Just on that last point, because I think it's fundamental. Because some people have said now that, the whole point is just get the clean product to Europe and it doesn't matter about global emissions. And I think that's a very misinterpretation of the problem. We're trying to track climate change as a global problem. So if they're only sending the clean product to Europe and they still have the cold stuff and they're exporting elsewhere, that's not good enough. I think that shouldn't be accepted. And my second point is on resource shuffling, and it's in your paper, it's noted that when you include scope 2, it becomes a bigger problem, because basically the differential is bigger on the scope 2 side than the scope 1. So I think there's kind of 2 points on that problem I just wanted to mention. Thanks.
Totally. And something that I think Vicente, Killian, all of you, I think will have to come back, because, solutions like what you just mentioned, Vicente, about the Russian Federation proposing to tax exports, I think they're going to pop up to a lot of places, and they're, it's not going to be hypothetical. So in some way, they're going to have to be addressed and addressed the proper way. So anyway, I want to thank you again. We try to engage into a vigorous debate, and I think we're a think tank, so that's what we do. And I'm gonna, I think we kept you longer than you had signaled initially. So again, thank you, and the best to you and your colleagues, and we will accompany you in this venture for the next 14, 16 months, whatever it's gonna take.
Thank you very much again for the occasion. Sorry for leaving now, but I'm sure that we will have possibilities to engage in the future again. So
as they say, until we meet again.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. So listen, let's go now to our little presentation of the document. So Alexandra, do you want to put that up, please? So this is the ERCST, arrogantly called Guide to the EU CBAM. For some reason doesn't want to okay, it does it. ERCST Guide to EU to the CBAM. As you know, we've been this is an activity that's been running for us now for almost 2 years. There's a number of products that we initially issued the kind of an analysis. We unpacked it into 9 components along 5 different areas of evaluation. And then we looked at the beginning of the year an in-depth sectoral look at it, which I thought was, or people seem to feel that it was well executed. And then we put together a proposal, which I don't know to what degree the crafters of this document, that this proposal have taken into account, but I think there are elements that we would like in our own arrogance would like to believe that they had some impact, and people have thought that it's worth listening to and reading. So, but we will never know. Everybody can claim credit for whatever they feel like it. Now, the next step that we said is that there is a proposal for the Commission. And we wanted to do an analysis of that proposal. But my colleagues and I have talked, and we have reached, let's go to the next one, Alexandra, have reached the conclusion that the best thing to do is to do a guide to the European carbon adjustment and border mechanism. And the difference between an analysis and a guide is this guide is really a living document. Why? Because it has a table of contents that goes about the context and evaluation of the CBAM and with the political economic context, history of EU debate, et cetera, international reactions. But then it goes into the guide to CBAM design elements. Now, under the guidance, the guide to the CBAM design elements, each of the 9, actually there's probably 11 now because we introduced something about objectives and so on. We divided it into a number of things. One of them was the summary. And in this case, is the summary of the proposal. Then would be relevant provisions. So for each of, for instance, the policy mechanism or coverage of trade flows, we went through the document and sought out the specific provisions in the CBAM proposal that refer to coverage of trade flows. And we put them in a table. So anybody who wants to find things very easy, hopefully they'll have this somewhere. And they say, well, I want to find out what it is. I don't have to go through the whole document again. Yes, here it is. If it's topic related to covered trade flows, this is where they are. Then we had a session. We had one section that deals with the evolution. And the evolution is really how the thinking has gone in this. Kellyanne, the leak is there, some of the early pronouncements from the commission, the parliament, the various players, they all, own opinion, et cetera. So it's all in there. And there's this analysis. And the last part of the analysis, what we did is in this analysis section, we took the five dimensions, environmental benefit, competitiveness, technical, administrative feasibility, legal feasibility, and political diplomatic feasibility, and kind of put a color code on for each of the 11 things. So if you took covered trade flow, then you would put, in the analysis, you look at the impact on environmental benefits and competitiveness and so on. So this is meant to be a living document, meaning that this is presumably there may be other versions or that may be put forward, there may be revisions. There will be the final document. So this is meant to evolve and not stay like this. So it will be a guide that we think will be useful for those that are working in this area, and that later that want to analyze how we arrived there and so on. Then we saw this amendment. Heck, I mean, this is a 65-page document. I know geeks and associations that read this stuff. But the other people don't really have the time or inclination or maybe even the expertise to read 65 pages of very dense text, because some of it is dense. So we again decided to say this is a summary for policymakers, a brief for policymakers. So we decided to put a 3 and a bit page document that would go into highlighting some of the things that we capture. Now, we're not the IPCC, so we are not negotiating this. The negotiation happened internally between the members of the team, but they were pretty hard negotiations, let me tell you that. So these are the 2 things that I wanted to talk about at the beginning of this thing. Now, what I'll do is I'll pass it on to Michael Milling to talk about some of the elements in the brief for policymakers. This is meant to be more of a conversational thing. We don't want to take you page by page and element by element, because I think it would be very boring. They will be captured, the main elements would be captured in this discussion, which is based on the summary for policymakers. So Michael, you go first, I believe, right?
Correct. Thanks, Andre. And a reminder that, of course, the links to the full reports for those who do want to go through 11 elements in detail are in the chat. you might remember that soon after the proposal was released, in fact, on the same day, we came out with sort of a 3 or 4 page assessment. And our kind of takeaway motto was that it represents a measured, pragmatic compromise. You know, in the meantime, this has now been 2 months. Our analysis, you know, we've I think refined the message a bit more, and it's really a glass half full, glass half empty perspective. Now, part of why it's so measured and pragmatic is the very deliberate pace of introduction of the CBAM, with this transition phase of several years where it doesn't really kick in, does not have a financial obligation for importers, and then a 10-year period in which free allocation is gradually phased out. So the status quo, if you like, of dealing with leakage, and this new instrument, this new experiment, if you like, this, at least at the national level, as yet untested approach to leakage is gradually phased in. And in this sense, the glass half full, you could say time is a friend. Having more time is definitely helpful to understand how the CBAM works, to understand if it works in the first place, and not, you know, launch right into the cold water, giving up everything that's been working in the past in order to sort of, well, sail into the future on an untested ship. It gives time for the Commission to work out what will undoubtedly still be some quirks and you know, some nuts and bolts that don't work quite from the outset. It gives time to refine that, to build up the infrastructure. It gives the member states time, and the member state administrations, to set up the required administrative structures, of course. And very importantly, it gives time to trade partners. This is especially important for anybody who follows WTO law. It doesn't sort of overwhelm them with an immediate new requirement. They have time to start building up their policies if they want to introduce carbon pricing. As we know, this is not something that any jurisdiction, including the EU, can do overnight. It takes time. It has to be based on engaging with stakeholders. There's a domestic political process. It's not easy. So this time is really necessary. And I think very importantly, and perhaps sometimes not mentioned enough in the debate, is technology continues to develop as well. And with technological progress on clean technologies, on clean technological alternatives in industry for ultra low carbon products, for, let's say, zero carbon industrial heat, for process heat, etc., the problem, of course, becomes more manageable over time. So by 2026, and let alone by 2035, we may in fact really have solutions so that leakage is no longer such a big issue, and the carbon embedded in traded goods is much less, and so on and so forth. All of this is sort of the glass half full. Time is our friend. At the same time, sorry, that was not meant as a pun. So simultaneously, we know that time is not our friend because time is super short. And a lot of the very difficult choices, and Vicente in his remarks addressed several of them, have been deferred for now. More importantly, you know, climate science tells us, and the latest report, or the Working Group 1 report of the 6th assessment report, you know, reminds us time is running out. We have enormous urgency to proceed really quickly with decarbonization. Yet the EGD at large, European Green Deal, sort of moves with that urgency. The CBAM seems to take a more deliberate pace. So this glass half full, where time is our friend, at the same time, in a way, is also our enemy. Time is short, and so there's a glass half empty side to it. So, and that's, I think, the sort of tenor that will come out of the next few slides when Aaron takes over in a second. But one thing I think I do want to underscore, this is a success, I believe, intended or not, and Vicente alluded to it. We have seen renewed and accelerated discussion of climate policies in a number of the countries most affected by CBAM. And I think while causality is always adventurous to claim, you know, it's a counterfactual analysis to some extent, like under the CDM, nonetheless, it is pretty clear that the link between the CBAM being rolled out, announced, etc., has gotten advisors in Russia, officials in Turkey, the government in Ukraine, to talk more actively about really accelerating their work on carbon pricing, and not just those countries, also others. And that, in a way, is perhaps the biggest success of the CBAM in the short term. We even thought of calling it the mouse that roared, because even though everything starts very late, you know, this sort of symbolic, this announcement is starting to show real effects. And with that, to Aaron, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not so sure how Vicente would have taken being told that his work of art is called above that word. So I think we backed off from that one. So Aaron?
Thanks. If we could go to the next slide. So as Michael said, we note that several of the more difficult design choices and issues have been pushed down the road in an effort to allow time to be friendly to us. But we, in our summary for policymakers and within the guide itself, we do note issues related to a number of really important questions. So I'll run through 4 of them, and then Alexandra will run through another 3. The first is one of a list of 7, but perhaps the most important in terms of its insoluble nature and its economic impacts is the issue of exports. So we have pushed all of these issues down the road, and some of them we can see a path toward improving the current approach in a way that will eventually work out methodological challenges, diplomatic challenges. This one we do not have, as far as we have understood, any particularly viable solutions. Any instrument that we can think of that will protect the export competitiveness of EU firms under the CBAM, that will protect their market share in third countries, is going to be considered an export subsidy under WTO law. And moreover, even if we can find some way to justify those measures as WTO legal and argue that they are WTO legal, will probably be subject, at least in some of the more trade litigious trading partners, to countervailing duties. So even if the WTO, even if we don't wait for a WTO process, there will be national processes that will offset whatever export support we put in place. This is an issue that still has to be dealt with, and it will be dealt with outside the CBAM. Indirect emissions, we've already talked about. The need eventually will be to cover indirect carbon costs, but or to in some way deal with the fact that eventually we need to bring these into the scope of the CBAM, but in doing so we have to figure out how to continue to cover carbon indirect costs as well as indirect emissions. We don't yet know how to do that. This is something that will have to be done before the inclusion of Scope 3 or Scope 2, and we expect that to happen. We expect it to be proposed as a result of the 2026 review and in the longer run. But we don't yet know how this is going to happen. This, of course, is where the question of resource shuffling is most acutely felt, as Killian said, simply because of the nature of electricity. You can shuffle around your export streams to those goods that have production processes that are more friendly, but it's much easier to shuffle around your purported sources of electricity and maintain the same production processes. So resource shuffling for Scope 2 is much more acute challenge. The issue of non-price-based foreign climate policies. So we have already discussed that in this session. Look, there's a dynamic here, and Vicente laid it out well. In the first instance, if you do give credit to non-price-based climate policies, you also need to have an adjustment for the EU's own non-price-based climate policies. Otherwise, you're subsidizing foreign production relative to domestic production. This seems clear enough. So there are methodological challenges with that. But of course, there is also a trade law challenge with that. We have a very bright red line in the sand saying that you can't charge at the border based on regulatory costs of domestic production. Those regulatory charges you impose on your domestic firms other than taxes. And you can see why it's a slippery slope. We would start having adjustments for corporate income tax, for minimum wage laws, for corporate social contributions, employment insurance, social security plans. There is a reason why that bright red line exists. So we are stuck here in legal terms and in real terms trying to find a solution. However, the political pressure to find that solution to allow for adjustment for non-price-based climate policies is very real, is acute. And so we think that there has to be some solution found over time to this problem. Finally, on sectoral choice, we note that we have started with a limited set of sectors, and sectors with complex downstream value chains like chemicals, Vicente referred to it as polymers, are not included for the moment. This is a methodological problem, and it's one of the ones that we can see perhaps a road to solving as we go through the transition period and the implementation and the delayed implementation, but not an easy one to solve, and certainly not easy as we go to trying to figure out what downstream coverage looks like. But this one is clear. We have to eventually include sectors like chemicals, like refining, because the leakage risk there is very real, but we have some methodological challenges before we can do that. In fact, there may be challenges in some of the sectors, even the limited number of sectors we've currently talked about as candidates, and we may end up having to drop some of those out to make a politically viable implementation period. I'll hand it over now to Alexandra to cover the last few key issues we've highlighted in our summary.
Okay, before Andre says unmute yourself. Good afternoon, everybody. So the next couple of issues that we are highlighting in the brief for policymakers is the emission scopes, and currently the CBAM proposal covers not only the emissions attributed to the covered goods, but for more complex goods, it also covers emissions embedded in inputs, in input goods. So this is a scope 3 emissions. So the specifics of that will be defined case by case for different sectors and products by implementing acts that go more into the technical details. But the understanding is that what this means is that if you are importing, for example, steel pipes, then the CBAM will cover not only the emissions arising from the transformation of steel into the piped products, but also emissions embedded in the crude steel used as the input material for the production of the pipes. This makes good sense from our point of view, and it provides protection against leakage and prevents risk of downstream competitiveness impacts. So from the point of view of the environment as well, it makes sense because often, depending on the product, the lion's share of emissions might be associated with these input materials in the share in terms of in the total. But of course, this might make it more complex administratively and technically, and it risks creating different treatment for imported goods vis-a-vis domestic goods. So this is something Aaron can jump in to explain a bit more in detail. But in this sense, it might create more political and diplomatic controversy, because partners can argue that there is discrimination. And then the next item is the revenues that we already touched upon, and what to do with revenues generated as of 2026 after the transition period. There are no provisions in the proposed regulation in that sense. There's only a reference that most revenues generated will go to the EU budget. So there's no provisions how these will be used. Will it be for climate purposes domestically or abroad, or for covering the administrative costs? We heard from the Commission that revenues will be dealt with in separate proposal that will be issued by end of the year. But of course, this is how to spend it is will be a very a real issue in the debate, whether it's under a separate proposal. Yeah, the absence of earmarking of revenues is maybe technically and administratively less complex, but it comes at a certain cost, cost of reducing legal, political, and diplomatic feasibility. It increases the chance that the CBAM is a revenue-raising tool, and might lead to stronger contestation and potential for challenges under WTO. So we do think that the EU should give a serious consideration to channeling revenues, or at least a significant part of revenues from CBAM back to developing countries affected. And this is even more important given that the proposal does not provide exemptions for least developed countries. And we're not arguing for such exemptions. It makes sense that there are no such exemptions, given that there are only few exports from these countries that would be impacted under this the proposed approach. And of course, any blanket exemptions of countries could give rise to circumvention through transshipment and so on. So it's sensible not to go that direction. But still, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is a legitimate concern, and this could and should be addressed through revenue sharing. Aaron, I don't know if you want to say a few words about the WTO.
Maybe if my official role on the team is WTO legal wet blanket. I'll wait to see if anybody is actually interested in diving deeper on the question of legality of including Scope 3 emissions. If not, I think you've done a good job of summarizing it.
Okay, let's move on to the last one. Look, I'm bringing the end of this. We started by looking at it and said, listen, these guys are punting a lot of difficult issues. This is the reality. I think I'm not making things up. Also, I think Vicente, I'm not putting words in Vicente's mouth, I'm speaking for myself. But I heard that, well, listen, we hope that we're pushing a few things, they will be solving. There will be a time when they will be maybe not so necessary, maybe they will solve themselves. Maybe there will be the political and regulatory environment will be different, and maybe one will change itself. And if I look at this, how would you qualify it? The mouse that roared, I'm not sure. I saw the movie a very long time ago, so I'm trying to remember the exact kind of how it came across. It was an old Peter Sellers movie. But it certainly is something that I could argue that, kind of is a trumpet, and it's getting people's attention but in the end right now is not taking a huge bite. It's going to be a while before it bites. I think it's quite clear that the intention is not going to bite anything until 26, and then it really is going to bite in the last part of the decade. So you could argue that in the current political and economic era, it is a sensible approach. We are still facing this bifurcation in the road where you get a CBAM, or you try to deal with the issue of carbon leakage. By the way, carbon leakage is not caused by somebody waking up in the morning and say, I shall carbon leak. Carbon leakage is caused by people making decisions that it's there for whatever reason, economically, one of them is that I shall move my production or my investment somewhere else. So to dissociate this from competitiveness, I don't see how intellectually I can argue that. I personally find it difficult. But nevertheless, we are in looking at UNFCCC and WTO. So it's got to be WTO, and Aaron is with the wet blanket, or he's a guy that talks because he really feels very strongly about this and knows this stuff well. It is seen, if you want, as more strict. It's got clearer appeals panels and all kind of stuff. The Paris Agreement got not much in terms of compliance. The Kyoto Protocol did have, but the Paris Agreement doesn't have that much. So, you're going to try to navigate these two worlds if you want. So to deal with the WTO, which could bite, but the Paris Agreement that doesn't bite, but it's got a bully pulpit. And I would, one could argue that yes, we're not telling them to do them what to do and how to do it, but by God, if you don't do emissions, if you don't do carbon pricing, and you don't do it at the same level as we do, we're gonna whack you. So it is, I'm not sure how this is going to play at COP26, but it's something to be seen. It's a very, kind of wire act. It's the art of possible, and a tool to get the EU to high universal carbon price, because in the end, that's what would be the kind of the dream, is to have this high carbon price driving things, and that you would be able in a position to impose that carbon price without deindustrializing, because the purpose is not to deindustrialize, the purpose to decarbonize Europe. We see that it is a pragmatic and sensitive, a justifiable proposition. There are two things that I need to be re-emphasized, and that will be lines in the sand. I mean, they're already lines in the sand. And we've seen that not because we made it up, we, in some way we're observers, but we saw it also in the Parliament's own initiative. One of them is the lack of the free allocation, and not that the fact that is being removed, because I think there's an expectation that at some point you're going to start running out of free allocation. I mean, we see that the cross-sectoral correction factor is going to hit. So, but is the pace of that, it doesn't look like a lot, 10%. The question is, you got to have these guys to also invest at the same time. And that raises some, the fact that we are testing the CBAM, putting it in place, but really not, if you want, not allowing to be tested while it bites, while it takes money from it. It's also something that is probably not quite right. The ETS was tested under somewhat real conditions. The second one is this lack of provision for export. It was interesting to hear Vicente say that this is really not going to be a great level of impact in the sectors that are currently being hit. And indeed, I think that we've got a few years until 26, 27, 28, but it's nevertheless, as Ronald Reagan used to say, recession is when your neighbor loses a job, and depression is when you lose your job. So I don't think you want to get to the point of kind of saying the guys, the import guys, the guys that produce domestically didn't lose their jobs, but the guys who are exporting a lot losing the jobs. I don't think you want to get to that one. So some of the more critical issues have been punted, but I think that it may not be under current condition, may be difficult, some of them to be addressed. So in the end, this is not a flying solo type of exercise. I think there are going to be other policies, other approaches, contract for difference, a number of other things that may be put forward that may have to accompany the CBAM. This is something that we're now talking our own book, because we'll put something like this together within the next couple of months. So this is our next kind of shoe to drop. But the last question, the parting question is, I will ask the audience and I will ask the stakeholders and the ones that are online at large, is this a starting point? Can we start from this as a discussion, or this is a non-starter? Is there a no, hell no, this won't go? We simply don't want a CBAM, and don't even think about it because we won't do it. Or is there a better proposal? Or is this something that we can start with? So these are some of the things that we thought we would bring up to our views. I think that we try to avoid being very opinionated, but on the other hand, we're also seeing that we should have opinions, or else what the heck are we doing here? Stopping here and inviting our invitees, starting with Killian, and then Charlene, Pavel, and I think Caroline, you wanted to go last, I believe. Yes. Okay. So Killian, you go first.
Thanks, Andre. So I'm Killian O'Donoghue. I'm Eurometto. I'm in a position where I represent aluminium, which is in CBAM, and I represent other sectors like copper, zinc, nickel, etc., which may be added at a later stage. Reading through both the guide and the proposal, I have 5 comments I want to focus on. Before I jump in, I would just say it's a very good document, and also it's very nice reading something which isn't legislative text. You read a lot of kind of proposals and legislative text and amendments. It's nice. This is kind of broken down very nicely. It's a nice read. So thanks for that. So my 5 points, I agree with what the paper says on indirects. I think it's a good approach. And what I would say, anybody who says indirect emissions should be in, you need to come with a solution to indirect carbon costs. So if you say it should be in, then come to us with a solution. That's what I would say. I think one of the only good benefits of this kind of electricity price crisis we're seeing now, the last 2 weeks, is that people are getting better knowledge of how electricity markets work, and they're becoming aware that we face the marginal price, that we pay for the fossil even when we consume renewable. And I think that's really been highlighted in Spain, but all over Europe, people are kind of getting a great awareness. So I think that's a good thing, and that will lead to better discussions in CBAM. On export rebates, I agree with what the position says. It says offer a solution, so we agree fully. I wouldn't take Aaron or anybody else on in a debate on WTO compatibility. I'm not a trade lawyer, so I don't know this stuff very well. I just know we need to find a solution, and it's something my members are very concerned about, and something which lots of industries are concerned about. I think if we do go to CBAM without a solution on exports, it's like having a bucket of water with a hole in it. It's a major weakness of the proposal. One thing that maybe the guide is lacking is more details on circumvention. I think that circumvention is going to happen, and it's a major concern. So I think that's something which the guide could maybe elaborate more on. As I said, Article 27 is very weak, and it's only a bit of product kind of substitution which counts. We need to look at resource shuffling, and you need to look at cost absorption. And I think maybe one way to do it is in maybe the secondary legislation, or however they want to do it, is when you get your license to come into Europe, you need to be, the Commission can check that you're not violating in terms of resource shuffling. I think we need to look at that in more detail and not be naive. On carbon pricing, noted what you say. I would just say, as industry, what we care about is that the reciprocal industry pays the same carbon price. So it's no good saying, okay, China is coming now with a CO2 price, if that does happen in the future, but they're going to exempt their industry. That doesn't really help us. And also, if it's only on the electricity sector and doesn't apply to industry, that doesn't help us. So for the important thing is, for the same industry in the corresponding country, the carbon prices have to be reciprocal. I think that's very important that we go to that level of detail and not just say they have carbon pricing. My last point, something that's not in the paper, but I think that's something which we should consider is there should maybe be a review clause, a stronger one in the whole text, because we don't know how this is going to be received. So if there is major reactions and they come with kind of tariffs, then maybe we might want to pause things, and we might want to pause the phase out. Also, we're gathering data for the next 2-3 years. It's a tough job. So if we don't have the data we need to have a kind of proper system in place by 2026, we may need to pause it. So I think it's good to have a review clause. It's prudent under those circumstances. And my last comment is, I would just agree with Andre is that at the very end of this process, we need to kind of say, is this an effective carbon leakage mechanism? So we've gone for CBAM, that's the decision. But we need to have a more detailed assessment saying, is this effective carbon leakage mechanism? is it more effective than what we have today? Is it more effective than free allowance and indirect compensation? We'll decide that at the end, but I think to some extent we've jumped into this and we're not too sure how effective it is as a carbon leakage mechanism. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Killian. That to the point. Charlene, I'm quite curious. I know some of your colleagues when they come to negotiations. I'm quite curious to hear your line of approach.
Thanks, Andre. You put me on the spot. As I said, I respond technically first and then just in terms of the broader negotiations. But thanks very much for the report and the earlier discussion, which I thought was very useful because I think we have a better idea now on the design of the CBAM, and it takes into account a lot of the comments that we've made through the process. I think just a few comments from my side, and especially coming from a developing country. So carbon pricing and a CBAM is not a silver bullet to all our problems. We've been very supportive, and as South Africa as well, around the role of carbon pricing, the need to internalize externalities, and to create those price signals for behavior change. But at the same time, we've been quite clear to say as well that to have that change, we need to manage the pace at which it is done. And in that context, we, as part of the design of the South African carbon tax, we started off with a tax at a very low rate, which is essentially under $3 effectively. On the margin, it's around $8, but because we have all of those exemptions, the effective rate of the tax is very low. It's comparable to the global carbon pricing internationally currently, especially around carbon taxation, which is under $5. But to actually get the change that we want and to use the price mechanism, we've seen that the pricing has to be much higher. And through the World Bank, the IMF, some of the proposals around $40 to $80 have been put forward to actually drive those changes. The CBAM is there as an instrument to address concerns around carbon leakage and competitiveness, but the key instrument is around the actual price and how that transitions over time to create those price signals for behavior change. And that's what we think is important. You asked the question, Andre, around a CBAM. Look, and how effective it could be as an instrument. The other approach is to actually look at some sort of minimum carbon price that applies globally, and that's been the approach that's been put forward by the IMF. From a practical perspective, it might be the better route to go. So the role of the CBAM needs to be considered in the context of broader carbon pricing measures. I think the second point just to make is that there is global efforts, including in South Africa, where we ran an extensive process around our NDCs for 2025 and 2030. We've put forward quite a stringent target in terms of reducing our emissions, especially for the period 2030. And a big condition around that is that we need to decarbonize the electricity sector. We mentioned the export of almost dirty or coal-based electricity to countries like Mozambique. We've initiated a process domestically around how do we decarbonize the electricity sector, start looking at the opportunities to shift to renewable energy. And in that context, when you're looking at process emissions from hard to abate sectors, there's an opportunity there to decarbonize them through the shift to renewable electricity. And that is what we have prioritized. So perhaps just to comment then on the question around the inclusion of direct and indirect emissions, I think twofold. The first is that the indirect emissions mainly relate to fossil-based electricity, if I understand correctly, and the way it's built into the EU ETS. The way to actually decarbonize is then to look at the alternative. Renewable energy is the alternative from a developing country, and as we see the case currently in the UK, the question around transition fuel the role for gas is going to be key. And the second part of that is this will have implications for pricing, for electricity pricing going forward, because of the investments that will be needed to accommodate renewable energy. So the inclusion of indirect emissions could be a massive challenge. I think there the role for policy instruments that directly target decarbonization of electricity would be the more appropriate way to go. I think just the third point around non-price climate policies. What we have been clear on is that the carbon tax forms part of a package of measures. It forms part of the commitments we've put forward under the NDCs, but also because we have a centralized electricity generation through one electricity service provider, we have to almost impose specific targets for renewable energy. That in itself is an active policy measure to encourage the shift. Because we can't price carbon at the rate of around 40 to 80 US dollars or 300 US dollars that may be required to achieve those the temperature goals we've set ourselves there. But what we can do is have the price on the margin as the stick, as well as regulatory measures as we start to transition. And a key issue there will be around how does the electricity sector also transition towards more competitive structures. So the non-price climate policies, it somehow needs to be incorporated, especially in the context of developing economies. Last 2 points from myself is around the sectoral scope in light of the chemical sector and the concerns around, final products, and then the inclusion of scope 3 emissions and intermediate inputs and products there. This is going to be a challenge, especially from an admin perspective on actually accounting for these emissions. And it's something that will require that globally countries then implement a similar system in terms of how you account for these emissions. Our current carbon tax is based on the IPCC guidelines of activities that result in emissions, and that covers the direct emissions. To ensure consistency in terms of scope 3 emissions and then even, the sectoral scope on chemicals and final products, proper methodologies have to be developed at a global level. And we think a lot more work needs to be done on that. And then lastly, around the revenues, the first point is that we have to estimate the amount of revenues that are coming from this. But the other issue, as I mentioned earlier, is around the just transition. And especially in a developing country context, where there are going to be vulnerable workers, vulnerable sectors in the coal sector, for example, but there needs to be the appropriate transfer of technologies, capacity building, and support around this. And in our case, reindustrialization in a greener way. And some of the areas we're prioritizing is around local manufacture when it comes to renewables, and some of those inputs there, but also we have minerals that enable us to do, to produce batteries and that can play a role in terms of electric vehicles, etc. So a more considered approach in terms of not just a CBAM on its own, but how that transition happens, the pace of that transition for developed countries and developing economies would be important, and what are the support measures, policies that are needed to support green industrialization would need to be considered in parallel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charlene. Pavel, from the member states.
Okay, thank you very much. Paweł Różycki from Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very interesting report. Indeed, it's not a legal text. It's not even impact assessment. So it's a pleasure to read it. And more or less, we've got more or less the same observation that are included in your report. But starting with the direct answer on your question, Andrea, I think we've got a good starting point to further discussion and to implement a tool that would strengthen our climate diplomacy, let's say. Because I think that we shouldn't look at the CBAM from the perspective of the carbon leakage protection. We think that it's the mechanism designed primarily to encourage our trade partners to raise their ambition in the climate field, and also to prevent goods that have a lot of CO2 in them, to prevent the import of such goods to Europe. So we've got another tool in the EU ETS that is dedicated strictly for carbon leakage protection. It's the free allocation. So I think that we should treat these two mechanisms separately. Of course, as far as it is possible, because of course those two issues are connected. However, we think that we should keep the free allocation as it is now until we will check how the CBAM works. So we are seeing, of course, the time you've mentioned is a crucial factor. But on the other hand, we should implement CBAM right. So we think that taking your previous parallel, we see glass half full, and we think that we should keep free allocation as it is until we will check what will be the effect of the CBAM. How will it implement the free allocation, the whole carbon leakage issue, and so on. So, if we don't, I'm afraid that we may have a situation, as we already have in Poland with our energy sector, that is buying that need to cover all the emission by allocation that they are buying on the market. So we may have a situation if we eliminate the free allocation that we will entail the necessity of incurring high costs by the industry sector, which is facing the greatest reduction efforts. So we may cause a number of adverse effects, such as loss of liquidity of many companies in Europe, and putting into question their financial credibility. This can lead to cost pass-through and hindering the green transformation of the whole sectors and of the assets of specific companies, which I think is particularly relevant after the recession provoked by the COVID pandemic. So that's why we should keep the free allocation as it is now, and decide after a few years of CBAM, after using CBAM. So I think that we should have balance between ambition, industry protection, and complexity of the system. So that's why I previously mentioned the whole issue connected with the administration of the system, as we think that we should keep it as simple as possible, It won't be easy, of course, but the whole ETS is very complicated. So we should avoid to create another system that would be which would be very complicated for users. So we should think about the administration. And I think that the combination of free allocation, carbon border adjustment mechanism, and some other measures to protect export from Europe will provide adequate and sufficient protection to European industry sector on the one hand, and on the other hand to encourage our trade partners to increase ambition outside the EU. As regard indirect emission, I'm not very keen on introducing indirect emission into the system of CBAM, as I think it's indirect emission are not connected with the production of goods with the companies. Are mostly connected with the energy mix of each country. So I think we shouldn't penalize the companies for the energy mix that is currently in their country. So that's why I think it would be difficult to implement the indirect emissions into the system. And as regards how to spend the revenues from the CBAM, we are open for discussions, and maybe it's also worth to discuss the Ldcs issues. So that's all my remarks for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pavel. Caroline, you're last as you requested. You can reflect on some of the things also that have been said.
Great. Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you for the invitation and for this excellent report. I learned a lot reading it. So I don't consider myself, unfortunately, an expert on CBAM, and the more discussions I'm involved in, the more I feel like it's just a hugely complex technical terrain to dive into. So I'm going to stay at the more political level. My work is focused on multilateral discussions in Geneva on trade, environment, and sustainable development issues. So my goal today is to bring some of that sort of Geneva or multilateral perspective to your discussion. So just first, 3 general points. And I mean, this has been alluded to in our discussion today, but I think it's really important that we remind ourselves that moving towards a decarbonized or nature positive and less polluting economy requires ambitious and rapid economic transformation in all countries, and attention to how to secure a just transition for all countries, as well as Charlene underlined. So we want to ensure not only that countries' exports to any country are decarbonized, for instance, but also that we're supporting decarbonization of production for internal consumption as well. So in this context, to my mind, the most important thing is that our trade policies and our climate policies incentivize and support countries everywhere to decarbonize, adapt to climate change, and also to thrive. Now, there's a tendency, for obvious reasons in discussions, to focus on sort of the biggest emitters, which of course is critical, and bilateral and transatlantic cooperation on these issues is key. But we also need to focus on enabling and fostering dialogue with the rest of the world. With all of the developed and other developed countries, and also the developing countries that are growing most rapidly and where emissions are growing most rapidly. And so I think it's really important that alongside efforts to create ambitious climate policies, governments and stakeholders within countries that are proposing these really consider carefully and address the range of impacts on their trading partners, and especially the challenges facing developing countries, so that we advance these policies in a way that's fair and reflects our wider sustainable development commitments at the international level. So the second general point I wanted to make is that politically, CBAM is not the only relevant topic on the climate and trade agenda, but at the moment, it's really dominating the discussion. So there's also a need to keep our eye on the wider context, on the one side around things like climate finance that are not directly in the trade arena. But even in the trade arena, we can think of other kinds of trade policies that can be harnessed to support climate action. So one of the things that I think warrants far more discussion in the debate is the climate impacts already on the trade of many of the world's least developed and most vulnerable countries. They're the ones who it's affecting their production, it's affecting their supply chains, it's affecting their trade-related infrastructure. Every time you have a hurricane, a cyclone, when there are droughts, fires, floods, it affects production in these countries. So I think that what we need to remind ourselves is that we need to create an environment where we can make progress on other climate and trade issues as well. So one of those is around trade in goods and services, where we know that we need to promote trade in renewable technologies and so on in order to help countries decarbonize, and around energy efficiency technologies and so on. But we also need to look at ways where we can identify that there are opportunities for developing countries to become players in green supply chains, to build their own green industrial capacity, so that as we build this decarbonized, greener global economy, they're not further marginalized than they are today. And so I think other issues on the agenda are things around climate standards, fossil fuel subsidy reform. There's work to be done around trade-related transportation emissions. There's a huge amount of work to be done around sustainable agricultural trade, and in ways that support nature and forests. We've also a huge amount of work to do around aid for trade-related climate adaptation, and to shift to climate-friendly exports. So to say this is what we don't want to do is have our CBAM discussion make it impossible for us to have some of these other very important political discussions too, which may deliver some benefits well before CBAM even kicks in. So the third element that I wanted to say is my feeling is just that cooperation and dialogue are lagging well behind. So CBAM has certainly put trade and climate on the agenda. And it also highlights that it's highlighted how far behind trade ministries are, for example, compared to finance ministries, where they have been talking about climate action for much longer, and cooperation around climate action. But we know we have limited scope for discussion on trade issues in the UNFCCC context. We have limited scope for discussion of climate in the WTO context. So a key point that I'd like to underline today is the need for more attention to multilateral dialogue and discussion on these issues. And that includes on CBAM, but shouldn't be limited to CBAM. Now, there are some promising developments at the WTO. The new Director General has stressed the need to ensure that the WTO contributes to global efforts to tackle climate change and addresses the nexus between trade and climate. We have the launch of the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability at the WTO, and we anticipate a ministerial declaration at the end of the year. One of the points in that will be about promoting dialogue around climate-related trade measures at the WTO. And I think these are all important because we just need to bear in mind the wider politics of climate and trade. Most developing countries can't begin to compete with the scale of green industry packages that the EU and the US are going to roll out, government procurement, subsidies, just massive R&D investment and so on. So it's a massive task for them to compete. Most don't have access to the relevant technology or financing to facilitate this transition. And so the question is, how do we best incentivize the shift? Now, CBAM might be part of that puzzle. I'm not the economist to do the impact assessment, but it's surely not the whole puzzle. And even reallocating the revenues of CBAM are going to be nowhere near enough to help promote that bigger shift. So my suggestion is that we have to look at CBAM in a much bigger context and see it as presented also as a small piece of a big puzzle that's about enabling and supporting transformation. And that we have to remind ourselves that there's been massive failures of climate finance, massive failures of technology transfer. Why would developing countries suddenly feel like in exchange for CBAM, all of this is suddenly going to come good? And many of these countries, we have to recognize, want to build their own green industries and compete in the green global, in the global economy. They don't just want to participate in it, they want to thrive and compete in it. And so that's, there's this wider context. So just to, I think I probably got a minute left, Andre. Is that right?
Go ahead.
No? Okay.
Please.
So I was just going to say, just on the specifics of CBAM, I just wanted to note that if you look in WTO committees over the last year, there have been concerns raised in the Council on Trade for Trading Goods, in the Committee on Market Access, and in the Committee on Trade and Environment by a broad range of countries from Russia, China, Paraguay, Uruguay, the US, Bahrain, Armenia, Indonesia, Pakistan, South Africa, Kazakhstan, India, Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, all raising questions about CBAM, and not opposing it per se, but all asking questions. And key themes are obviously around WTO rules, concerns that that it should not create unnecessary barriers to trade, concerns about the scope, the transparency of the process, links to UNFCCC principles on like common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. There are concerns about transition periods, about how they're going to measure and evaluate carbon emissions, and the administrative challenges and costs, obviously the issues of exemptions for LDCs. But I think the key point I wanted to raise here is that there's a sense that people don't understand so well exactly what the impacts of CBAM are going to be, but they see it in the wider context of many countries potentially adopting these policies. So it's a dynamic and shifting arena. Not only will they be more, but they will expand to more sectors. So this isn't really a debate just about CBAM, it's about the ideas of BCAs and climate-related trade measures at the border. And I should just, a final point that I'm sure my colleagues at the WTO would like me to mention is in the last few years, there has been a rise in notifications to the WTO about trade-related climate measures. Now, most of these are not contested, which does underline that it's possible to take many climate measures in ways that are fully compatible with WTO rules. But we will see more and more tensions, I imagine, as countries ramp up their climate policies. So, and the one other issue that's come up, I think, in the WTO context, around concerns about developing countries, is it's not just about the sector you're targeting, but the supply chain as a whole, in which many developing countries may be involved in providing inputs to a supply chain that that is affected by a sectoral related measure. So just to close, I think the key point from my side is that just to reinforce the importance of ongoing dialogue about BCAs in the context of a wider discussion around climate trade, and to remind stakeholders everywhere that at the same time as we rightly pursue ambitious climate policies, we really have to consider the impacts on trading partners and really interrogate what is going to make the biggest difference in terms of incentivizing change in our trading partners as well as at home. So thanks, Andre. I'll leave it there.
Incentivizing change sounds like a good thing, but I think some of them may not see it quite as an incentive. Some would say might see it as a stick, not a carrot. But maybe I get it wrong. The other thing, Carolyn, Aaron and I, not after we finish this session, we actually haven't. It's simply coincidental, but Aaron will smile when I say this. We're going to the session that we have on response measures. So I don't know. I asked a question in the Substack in June, and I got about the same reaction that you got. Is people kind of raising their flag and bringing it up, but not taking it a step forward. And I don't know whether it was because there was nothing out on the table yet, or because that was the instruction for capital, or what it is. But it certainly would be interesting to see in Glasgow how people react to this. I want to, Michael and Aaron, you guys want to react in some way quickly to these many very interesting points. I picked a few up in my notes, but there are a lot of very interesting points. Besides the congratulations for a great work we did.
Yeah. Aaron, how about I buy you 30 seconds? I don't have much. I have like 8 pages of notes, and I'm worried that I won't be able to decipher them later. I mean, there's been really, really great points. And what I liked especially is very different from very different perspectives. So I suspect, it goes back to selecting a very diverse and panel with very different perspectives. So that's very useful. One point, I've been using my orange highlighter to sort of mark a few. One point that Pavel, you made, and it struck me, because in the last few days, when starting to read more commentaries, opinion pieces, even by people here in the US looking at energy prices in the EU and the gas market and coal and how the carbon price is exacerbating things and so on, and alongside, of course, inflation concerns, and you were voicing something that I think, in the past, we've always been criticizing free allocation for muting the price signal and failing to enable full cost pass-through, or at least less imperfect cost pass-through of the carbon price to consumers, because that's what obviously economists want to see, the price signal arriving at those that can make decisions to then reduce consumption of carbon intensive goods. You kind of turned it around and said, see, and one of the risks is that CBAM will allow, because free allocation goes out, we will see more cost pass through and this will hit consumers. so it's, and I think you're not wrong in stating that, because I think you're right that in the climate that we will be facing, the economic climate, again, no pun intended. So in the economic context that we potentially will be seeing more and more of post-pandemic, enormous amounts of, debt financed stimulus and so on, there are going to be probably more inflationary pressures, and we are seeing supply chain crunches, and not only in industry but also in energy, that this could become a real risk politically for the viability of the continued pace of decarbonization, which, as Carolyn rightly reminds us, we have been able to kind of pay for with these massive stimulus packages and these ambitious packages, but that's quite a luxury sort of prerogative of some very rich regions of the world. So I'm curious, because I think that you have pointed to something that's potentially going to be politically way more challenging than we anticipate, and it's part of many moving pieces going forward. And how the CBAM features in that is indeed an interesting piece. Anyway, so that was one thing that I picked up. It's by no means perhaps the most important one, but I thought I'd raise it.
Thank you, Michael. And Alexandra, in case you wonder why I made you host from myself, is because I'm getting this bizarre signals on my computer saying that the power is out in 5 minutes, and I don't understand why. But it's safer that way. Aaron?
So as soon as you drop off, I'll start talking about WTO law, because then you won't be there to contradict me. So, like Michael, I have a hard time picking the key elements of this discussion because it was so rich. So I would just kind of focus on one element that I found interesting and follow up on something that Carolyn said. This can't be seen as just a discussion about the CBAM. We are in a context of international players like Canada, like the UK, like the US in some respects, also expressing their willingness to and intent to put in place similar measures at the border. It's the beginning of a larger movement toward accounting for carbon embedded in goods, commodities internationally traded. So from the perspective of the geopolitics of it, from the perspective of the climate negotiations, from the perspective of developing country relationships, it is more than just the CBAM. We are, in fact, faced with a number of these, and it argues, frankly, for better multilateral cooperation and agreement on what should be the principles that guide the elaboration and the implementation of instruments like this. What should be what do we consider multilaterally to be best practice? And I think a discussion like that, whether it happens within the WTO, within the OECD, wherever it happens, is long overdue and could help inform the practice at the national level of putting in place these kinds of mechanisms. So I'm sorry, this takes it beyond the scope of this particular meeting, but I thought I would pick up that point and elaborate.
Anybody wants to? I'm not seeing, and this is why I'm, at some point we are going to start to kind of phase out this hybrid virtual meetings, because there's a huge difference between people in the room and people on the screen. Of course, we don't expect Charlene or Carolyn necessarily to jump on a plane, but in general, people in Brussels could be present. But any reaction? I don't see any reactions from the floor, which is disappointing. But nevertheless, anyone else on the panel that want to react? My sense is that the CBAM discussion is probably going to not take any bigger, if you want, amplitude than we currently have, because simply people don't want to have it. The impression I'm having is that if you want to make a big deal out of it, then you will make a big deal out of it. But it is not the impression that the parties, at least in the Paris Agreement, are willing to make a big deal of it right now. That is the impression, the live impression. Why? It is a political calculation, the negotiation happening, and this would be too damaging in other spheres or whatever it is. But it is not the sense that I have. I continue personally. I continue to have this question, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's a contradiction to me. On one side, we say that we have common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here because my screen just went off, but I can see you on my computer. I'm seeing you on my computer screen, so that's cool. So on one hand, we say that, and on the same time, we say that we have this desire to kind of tax, kind of make people pay the same amount, et cetera, et cetera. On the same time, say, well, but this is not good enough. You got to clean yourself. Man, I mean, which one is it? Which one is it? This is like my late mother. My wife proposed that my mother proposed that we move in the same house, and she couldn't take yes for an answer. So it is a little bit like that. So every time I hear an argument, it just goes on to another level, and nobody wants to touch this one. So any final remarks on this topic? I see a chat here, but I'm going to have difficulty reading it. I'm sorry. Michael or Aaron, you guys can see this because I'm having a great amount of difficulties. Yeah, I'm having a great amount of difficulty reading the screen. It's comments probably.
It is a short comment, and I think it's a complimentary one. So
it's compliments, yes.
Well, okay, compliments are welcome. Well, final comments then on the part of any of you at on the panel. If not, I think that we will continue the work on this. But before I tell you what's next, any last thoughts that you want? Anything you want to add, Killian?
Yeah, just as a closing remark, I just say one thing. I think that we should take time to go through it and go through the proper co-decision process. You read in some papers, they're saying we want to get this all kind of sorted by the French presidency in March, April. And this is a very, very technical file involving huge amount of things and involving a huge international angle. So let's take our time. Let's go through the due process. That's the only thing I wanted to say.
Okay, no, that's something that I, considering where we are right now in the, just coming out of hibernation, so to speak, but that's what it is. People are coming out of hibernation. Society seems to be coming slowly. The limbs, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Danes say, okay, life is back to normal. Others are less back to normal. It's quite a decision. I don't want to express myself, but it certainly be interesting to understand better this impulse to finish this quickly. If there are no more comments, all I will say is thank you all for taking part in this. I think, for us, it continues to be a very interesting intellectual exercise that's divorced from reality, because we are kind of wading into a debate that is a hard debate with a lot of consequences for a lot of people. It's not kind of a fun thing to do when nobody gets hurt. It is a very important point that is not that will have consequences for Europe, for trade, and for many livelihoods. But looking next will be at a menu of approaches that could accompany a CBAM. Because are there ways that you can accompany the CBAM on exports, on indirect? There are different things. And these are the kind of things that we would like to add as a kind of a last paper. But then there's this whole process that goes forward past at the end of this year, whether it is within the French presidency, which sounds very optimistic, but maybe there are others that make political decisions. and there will continue to be a discussion. And I think that the establishment of a border carbon adjustment, if there isn't a border carbon adjustment, is going to be a first step, because how this is going to develop, how the taking stock in the UNFCCC process is going to materialize, how that is going to marry to this 2026 review. I mean, that's going to keep us in a very interesting and important point. You know, you do read that you're dealing with sacred cows, but in the end, we know there are no sacred cows. And in this world that we are right now, we seem that anything is possible. As we said, this particular proposal seems to be the art of the possible, but we'd like to see how possible it's going to be in the end. So thanking all of you, and we shall see you within the next few weeks. Again, about 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, we will continue our discussion, but then hopefully we'll see some of you in person at the COP. Thank you very much all, and have a good time. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.